Millions of fans watched the New England Patriots reach their first Super Bowl in franchise history in January of 1986, a wild-card underdog run that felt like a fairy tale right up until kickoff. Then the Chicago Bears beat them by 36 points, the worst loss in Super Bowl history at the time, and the fairy tale cracked open to reveal something much darker underneath. Domestic violence, cocaine, a car crash mid-game, a prison sentence for the team's born-again redemption story. Losing, it turns out, has its own body count. This is where the 1985 Patriots really ended up. One is the defensive tackle, whose name became the public face of a scandal that consumed the team the moment the season ended. Kenneth Sims was the first overall pick in the 1982 NFL Draft, a Lombardi Award winner out of Texas expected to anchor the Patriots' defensive line for a decade. Injuries had other plans. 1985 was the only fully healthy season of his career, and even that one ended with a broken leg that kept him out of the Super Bowl entirely. Days after the loss to Chicago, the Boston Globe named Sims as one of several Patriots players who had struggled with drug use during the season, prompting the team to institute a voluntary drug testing program, the first of its kind in the league. Sims admitted publicly to a marijuana problem and entered a team-supported rehabilitation program, a moment presented at the time as a clean break. It wasn't. In 1990, Sims was arrested in Austin, Texas, and charged with possession of cocaine, and the Patriots released him within weeks for failing to stay in football shape. He resurfaced briefly with the Buffalo Bills in 1992, by then described in the press as a recovering alcoholic, and was waived before the season began. Kenneth Sims died in his sleep at his home in Waynesville, North Carolina, on March 21, 2025, at age 65. He had been inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame 4 years earlier, honored for a college career injuries and addiction never let him repeat as a professional. Sims was drafted to build a dynasty. He became instead the first name attached to the story of what that season actually cost. Two is the wide receiver whose scandal broke before the Super Bowl even started, and whose entire adult life afterward became a public wrestling match between ruin and redemption. Irving Fryar was the first receiver ever drafted first overall, taken by New England in 1984, and by 1985 he was a Pro Bowler catching passes on the franchise's first conference championship team in over a decade. 4 days before the AFC title game, Fryar's pregnant wife Jacqueline cut his hand with a kitchen knife during a domestic altercation, an injury that required 6 stitches and nearly ended his season. He played in the Super Bowl anyway, with a cast on his finger, scoring New England's only touchdown of the game. The following season brought more chaos. Fryar admitted to using drugs during the '85 campaign, was investigated by the league over gambling allegations, was sued for assault, and separated his shoulder in a game only to leave the stadium mid-contest and crash his car into a tree while listening to the second half on the radio. He hit rock bottom in 1990, arrested on weapons charges, sitting in a jail cell when he said God spoke to him for the first time. He became an ordained Pentecostal minister, earned a doctorate in theology, and built a congregation at his New Jerusalem church in New Jersey, a redemption story the NFL held up as a model for troubled players for over 2 decades. In 2015, that story collapsed again. Fryar and his mother were convicted of conspiring to defraud 6 banks in a mortgage fraud scheme, and Fryar was sentenced to 5 years in prison, ultimately serving 8 months before his release. He remains a pastor today. Fryar caught the Patriots' only touchdown in the worst Super Bowl loss in history, with stitches still fresh in his hand. Irving Fryar spent the next 4 decades proving that a redemption story and a cautionary tale can be the same man, sometimes in the same year. If Fryar's story is the one that got you, tell me in the comments which member of this team hit you hardest, because the next man on this list became a punchline for a single half of football he'd probably like to forget. 3 is the quarterback who became, statistically, the worst starting performance in the history of the Super Bowl, and who chose silence over rebuttal for the 4 decades that followed. Tony Eason led New England through an improbable 1985 playoff run as a wild-card team, throwing 5 touchdowns without an interception across 3 road playoff victories to reach Super Bowl 20. Then Chicago's vaunted 46 defense, coordinated by Buddy Ryan, sacked him repeatedly, and Eason finished 0 for 6 passing before being pulled early in the second quarter, the first and still only starting quarterback in Super Bowl history never to complete a single pass. His own teammate, Hall of Fame lineman John Hannah, later said publicly that he'd hoped Eason would stay injured so backup Steve Grogan could start instead. Eason played 2 more injury-shortened seasons in New England before being traded to the New York Jets in 1989, retiring after the 1990 season at age 31. He largely disappeared from public football life afterward, surfacing briefly around 2002 coaching basketball in the Sacramento area, giving almost no interviews about the Super Bowl that defined his career from the outside. He is alive today in his mid-60s, having spent nearly 40 years letting a single half of football speak louder than he ever has himself. Eason threw for 0 yards on the biggest stage of his career. Tony Eason has spent every year since choosing not to explain it to anyone. 4 is the Hall of Fame guard many still consider the greatest offensive lineman who ever played, and the man whose brutal honesty about his own quarterback became a permanent part of Super Bowl folklore. John Hannah anchored the Patriots' offensive line for 13 seasons, earning 10 straight All-Pro selections and the nickname Hog for a ferocity Bear Bryant himself called unmatched among every lineman he ever coached at Alabama. Hannah retired immediately after Super Bowl 20, ending his career on the same field where his quarterback went 0 for 6, a fact he did not stay quiet about afterward. He became the first Patriot ever inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1991, and Sports Illustrated has called him simply the greatest offensive lineman in NFL history. After football, Hannah tried coaching, taking over a winless high school program in Somerville, Massachusetts, and later working as a special assistant at his old prep school in Tennessee, before stepping back from football entirely to live a quiet family life. He is alive today, in his mid-70s, one of the last men from that Super Bowl roster still willing to speak plainly about what happened in New Orleans. Hog Hannah protected quarterbacks for 13 years without complaint. John Hannah is the one who made sure history remembered exactly whose fault the worst half of football in his career actually was. 5 is the backup quarterback famous for 2 things: playing through more broken bones than nearly anyone in franchise history, and being the only person to score a Patriots touchdown in the most lopsided Super Bowl loss ever recorded. Steve Grogan spent 16 seasons in New England, a 5th-round pick who became the franchise's all-time passing leader by the time he retired, absorbing 5 knee surgeries, 2 ruptured discs, a broken leg, 2 separated shoulders, and 3 concussions along the way, wearing a signature neck roll that became as recognizable as his jersey number. Benched for most of the 1985 season behind Tony Eason, Grogan was called off the bench in the second quarter of Super Bowl 20 after Eason's disastrous start, and threw the only touchdown pass New England managed all game in the 46-10 defeat. He retired in 1990, holding nearly every meaningful Patriots passing record, later inducted into the team's Hall of Fame. Unlike nearly everyone else on this list, Grogan built a second life that never depended on football nostalgia to survive. For over 2 decades, he has owned and operated a sporting goods store in Mansfield, Massachusetts, selling uniforms and equipment to the same youth leagues and high schools he once played against as a kid in Kansas. He is alive today, in his early 70s, running a small business a few miles from the stadium where he used to play. Grogan absorbed more punishment than almost any quarterback of his generation and kept getting up. Steve Grogan spent the rest of his life selling equipment to kids instead of selling anyone a story about what it cost him. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because the man who coached this entire team just died this year, only weeks before training camp opened for the next one. 6 is the head coach who built New England's first Super Bowl team out of a real estate office, having left football entirely before the franchise called him back. Raymond Berry was already a Pro Football Hall of Famer by the time the Patriots hired him in 1984, a legendary Baltimore Colts receiver who had retired as the NFL's all-time leader in both catches and receiving yards, forming one of football's great early partnerships with quarterback Johnny Unitas. After his playing days, Berry drifted through assistant coaching jobs before stepping away from the sport to work in Massachusetts real estate. The Patriots pulled him back in the middle of the 1984 season, and by January of 1986, he had led the franchise through its first-ever Super Bowl appearance, a run built on his famously meticulous, deeply private preparation. Berry coached New England through 1989 before moving on to a brief stint with the Denver Broncos, then retreated into a quiet, devoutly religious retirement with his wife Sally in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, staying largely out of the public eye for the next 3 decades. His last significant public appearance came at Super Bowl 46 in 2012, when he was given the honor of carrying the Vince Lombardi Trophy onto the field at the Colts' former home stadium. Raymond Berry died in Murfreesboro on May 25, 2026, at age 93, survived by his wife of 65 years and 9 grandchildren. He was the last man standing from that coaching staff, gone now only weeks before this video was written. Berry once turned a losing franchise into Super Bowl contenders, using nothing but discipline and film study. Raymond Berry left this world only a few months ago, the final man from that Super Bowl sideline still around to have seen all of it happen. If Berry's passing is the one that got you, tell me in the comments, because the last name on this list wasn't even on the field in 1985, and his absence says more about this team than almost anyone who actually played that season. 7 is the man whose empty locker was still being felt 7 years after he last suited up for this franchise. Darryl Stingley was a star wide receiver for the Patriots in the mid-1970s, a first-round pick out of Purdue whose career ended at age 26 during a 1978 preseason game in Oakland, when a hit from Raiders safety Jack Tatum compressed his spinal cord and broke his 4th and 5th cervical vertebrae. Stingley never walked again, spending the rest of his life as a quadriplegic, though he eventually regained limited movement in one arm. By 1985, Stingley had become the Patriots' director of player personnel, working in the same front office that built the Super Bowl 20 roster, a permanent, living reminder inside the building of exactly what this sport could take from a man in a single collision. He never received an apology from Tatum, and the 2 men never reconciled, even when HBO offered to bring them together for a 25th anniversary special. Stingley wrote a memoir titled Happy to Be Alive, started a nonprofit for at-risk youth in his native Chicago, and became, by every account, one of the most gracious men in the building, despite everything. Darryl Stingley died at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago on April 5, 2007, at age 55, after being found unresponsive at his home. His autopsy cited heart disease and pneumonia, complicated by decades of quadriplegia. Stingley was never on the field for the worst Super Bowl loss in NFL history. Darryl Stingley didn't need to be on the field in 1985 to remind every man in that building exactly what the game they were playing could still take from them. They rest now in the North Carolina mountains, in a Chicago cemetery for a man who never walked again, in a Tennessee town Raymond Berry chose for quiet, and in the memory of a Super Bowl that still holds the record for the worst loss most of these men ever survived. One still runs a sporting goods store outside Boston. One still preaches every Sunday to a congregation that knows exactly who he used to be. The 1985 Patriots never got their ring, and 40 years later, the version of this story that actually happened turned out to be far more complicated than the blowout on the scoreboard ever let on.